Okay, so today we're really strapping in, for a deep dive into military strategy with like one of the greats, Carl von Clausewitz, and his masterpiece on war.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, we're tackling Book 8, Chapters 4 and 5, where he really gets into the nitty-gritty of how to, I'm just going to say it, overthrow your enemy.
Yeah, he doesn't mince words, does he? He gets right down to it.
No, he doesn't.
Um, but I think before we get too far, it's important to remember that, Clausewitz is writing in the 19th century, right? So he's
Right.
coming from a time of muskets and cannons, not, drones and cyber warfare. But that's what makes it so fascinating to me because the principles that he lays out are surprisingly relevant even in today's world.
Totally. It's like he cracked some kind of code.
Yeah.
But understanding conflict, right? Like,
Yeah.
no matter how much technology changes these core principles of strategy, they always kind of remain the same.
Exactly. And, one of the key takeaways from these chapters is that, simply conquering territory isn't always enough.
Right.
Clausewitz argues that the true aim of war should be to break the enemy's will, to fight to, shatter their capacity to wage war effectively. He calls
Yeah.
this overthrow.
So it's not just about, winning battles or taking land. It's about something bigger, right? It's about completely dismantling the enemy's ability to resist.
Yes.
If you think about it in like a boxing analogy, it's not about scoring points. It's about like going for the knockout punch.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, he uses several historical examples.
Okay.
He argues that if the forces opposing the French Revolution in 1792 had taken Paris, they could have potentially ended the war then and there, even if French armies were still active in the field.
Wow. So capturing Paris, the heart of the revolution,
Yeah.
that would have been a more decisive blow than like defeating a French army on some like distant battlefield.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that sometimes seizing a strategically important location, a capital city, a critical port, a vital supply hub can be more impactful than achieving a purely military victory.
So it's about targeting their ability to function, to govern, to maintain their war effort.
Exactly. And to kind of drive this point home even further, he brings up Napoleon.
Right.
Even when Napoleon held Vienna in 1805, it wasn't enough to secure a lasting victory.
But Napoleon was famous for taking enemy capitals. He even took Moscow. What was different in those cases?
Well, so Clausewitz argues that in those instances, the enemy's ability to wage war was not completely broken.
Huh.
For example, in 1805, Napoleon hadn't decisively defeated the Austrian army at the Battle of Austerlitz, and in 1812, even though he captured Moscow, the Russian army remained largely intact and able to continue resisting.
So in those cases, Napoleon focused too much on the territory and not enough on the real prize, the enemy's capacity to make war.
Exactly. Clausewitz highlights the danger of mistaking territorial gains for strategic victory. He argues that Napoleon should have prioritized destroying the Russian army over capturing Moscow.
So it's not just about brute force, it's about strategy, it's about hitting the right targets. But with something as big and messy as a war, how do you even begin to identify where to strike that decisive blow?
Right. Well, that's where Clausewitz introduces one of his most famous concepts,
Okay.
the center of gravity.
Okay.
He argues that every enemy, every war effort, has a center of gravity, like a central point that holds everything together.
Okay, so the center of gravity, it's like their Achilles heel. The one thing that if you can take it away, the whole enemy war machine just grinds to a halt.
Exactly. And the key is that it's not always a physical thing. It could be an army, it could be a city, a political alliance, or even something less tangible like public opinion.
Huh.
Clausewitz even suggests it could be the personality of a leader.
Wow. So toppling the leader, dividing their allies, demoralizing their population, these can all be just as effective as winning like a major battle.
Precisely. It's about understanding the enemy's strengths and their weaknesses, and then striking at the point where you can have the greatest impact. And this concept of the center of gravity, it's not just some dusty old theory. It's incredibly relevant in modern warfare, too.
Oh, I bet. Give me some examples. What might be a center of gravity in today's world?
Well, just think about it. Yeah. It could be a critical supply line for an army, a particular technology they rely on for communication or intelligence, or even a charismatic leader in a terrorist organization.
Right.
Finding and exploiting that center of gravity, that's what can shift the balance of power.
This is where it gets really interesting, right? Like connecting these centuries-old ideas to the battlefields of today. It's like Clausewitz is this strategic oracle speaking across time. But let's say you've identified the enemy's center of gravity or their weak spot. What's next?
Speed and decisiveness. Clausewitz was a firm believer in striking swiftly and decisively once you've identified the enemy's weak point. He strongly advised against dragging out a war any longer than necessary.
He sounds like a rip off the Band-Aid kind of strategist.
Oh,
Get in, achieve your objective, get out. But why was he so opposed to prolonged conflicts? I mean, beyond the obvious human cost, of course.
right. Well, Clausewitz recognized that delay often benefits both sides equally.
Okay.
For example, waiting for reinforcements might seem like a good idea on the surface, but it gives the enemy time to regroup and prepare as well.
So you're not really gaining an advantage. You're just prolonging the inevitable.
Exactly. And on top of that, delay gives the enemy time to potentially forge new alliances for public opinion to turn against the war or for other unforeseen circumstances to arise.
So in a way, time itself becomes another enemy.
You could say that. He argued that concentrating your forces and aiming for a swift, decisive victory is often the most effective approach. It disrupts the enemy's plans, it demoralizes their forces, and can potentially shorten the overall duration of the conflict.
It's that whole shock and awe element, right?
Yeah.
Hit them hard and fast before they even have time to react. But what about situations where total overthrow just isn't feasible? Say if you're dealing with a smaller nation state that doesn't have the resources for a full-scale war.
Well, that's where Clausewitz's nuance really comes into play.
Okay.
He recognized that sometimes due to political, logistical, or strategic limitations, total overthrow might not be achievable or even desirable. In these cases, he outlines two alternative approaches.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay them on me. What are these alternative approaches?
So first, you have what Clausewitz calls the offensive with limited aims. Imagine a smaller nation striking first not with the goal of conquering a larger enemy, but to gain a temporary advantage or force some kind of negotiated settlement.
So it's like a calculated gamble, a way to punch above your weight and maybe tip the scales in your favor without going all in.
Exactly. And then you have the flip side, which he calls the defensive to buy time. In this scenario, a weaker nation adopts a defensive posture, trying to hold out against a stronger enemy for as long as possible.
Hoping for what? Reinforcements. A shift in the political landscape.
Precisely. The goal is to buy time, either for external help to arrive or for the enemy's resolve to weaken. Think of it like holding a castle siege. You might not be able to defeat the besieging army outright, but if you can hold out long enough, they might eventually give up or be forced to withdraw.
So in essence, Clausewitz is saying there's no one-size-fits-all approach to warfare. You have to choose the right strategy based on your specific situation and your desired outcome.
Absolutely. And what's even more fascinating is how relevant these ideas are to modern military operations.
Okay, I'm hooked. Walk me through it. How do these limited objectives play out in the complexities of modern warfare?
Well, let's start with that idea of defensive to buy time. A modern example of this could be a strategic withdrawal. Imagine a military force choosing to pull back from a particular area, not because they've been defeated, but to consolidate their strength, avoid a larger confrontation, and live to fight another day. It's about choosing your battles strategically.
So it's a form of calculated retreat, not admitting defeat, but rather maneuvering into a more advantageous position, or bussing time for a counteroffensive.
Exactly. And then there's the idea of the offensive with limited aims. Think about peacekeeping missions. These aren't about total conquest, but about achieving specific limited objectives, like stabilizing a region, protecting civilians, or enforcing a ceasefire agreement.
Or even something like a surgical strike to cripple an enemy's nuclear capabilities, for example. You're not trying to take over the whole country, but you are trying to neutralize a specific threat.
Precisely. It's about understanding the nuances of your objective and applying the right kind of pressure to achieve it. Clausewitz recognized that sometimes a limited objective carefully executed can be just as impactful as a full-scale invasion.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the ultimate goal of overthrowing the enemy to identifying their center of gravity and even adapting your strategy to pursue more limited objectives when necessary. It's incredible how much insight Clausewitz was able to pack into his work.
Yeah, he really was a strategic mastermind. And you know what's fascinating to me? Even though he was writing about warfare in the 19th century, his ideas still resonate so strongly in the 21st century.
It's like he tapped into something fundamental about the nature of conflict itself, that no matter how much technology advances or how much the world changes, those core principles of strategy, they remain timeless.
Exactly. And I think that's the key takeaway for anyone studying Clausewitz, whether you're a historian, a political scientist, or even someone in a completely different field. His work reminds us that conflict in all its forms is rarely straightforward. It requires careful analysis, strategic thinking, and a deep understanding of your own goals as well as your adversaries.
It's about being adaptable, right?
Yeah.
Being able to shift your strategy based on the situation, the terrain, the enemy, and even your own limitations.
Absolutely. And perhaps most importantly, it's about never underestimating the psychological and political dimensions of warfare. As we've seen with Clausewitz's concept of overthrow, sometimes the most decisive victories are won not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the people.
It's about breaking the enemy's will to fight, not just their ability to wage war.
Exactly. And that's a powerful concept that has implications far beyond the realm of traditional warfare.
It really does make you wonder, in today's world with all this global interconnectedness and instant communication, what would Clausewitz consider the ultimate center of gravity?
Oh man, that's the question, isn't it? Is it economic dominance? Control of information? The ability to shape global narratives? It's fascinating to think about how Clausewitz's ideas could be applied to these complex challenges of the 21st century.
It really is. And on that note, I think we've given our listeners plenty to chew on today. Whether you're a seasoned strategist or just starting to explore the world of military thought, Clausewitz's work offers a timeless blueprint for understanding the nature of conflict.
Couldn't agree more. His insights remain as relevant and thought-provoking today as they were centuries ago.
Well said. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions. And as always, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.